Veteran's Voice, stories that deserve to be heard.
Hello, my name is Justin Miller, retired Navy Senior Chief, and this is my story. So I am originally from the Orlando area. I was born in ORMC, and I grew up in Central Florida. My Navy journey began really in first grade. I was at a friend's house doing a sleepover, and we watched two movies that night at his house. One was Back to the Future, and the other was Top Gun. And so from that moment on, I decided that I was going to be in the Navy. That's what I pursued through middle school and high school, and once I joined the Navy, and did it for 20 years. The movie wasn't necessarily about the aviation, the flight ops. It was more about the service, the uniforms, the crisp service, the taking risks and doing something bigger. That's pretty much what has been a shaping, driving force for my entire personality, my entire life. The idea of service. So the Navy was the right answer, and it's where I wound up. After high school, joined the Navy right out of high school. Graduated from Lyman High School in Longwood, Florida in May. Left for boot camp just after July 4th weekend. Last movie I saw before I left with my grandparents and my girlfriend, who became my wife later, was Independence Day in Lake Mary. Went to boot camp, joined up as a Navy cryptologist. Our job is to collect and report on intelligence that we receive and communicate upwards to consumers in national security and in the Navy. So joined the Navy, became a cryptologist, served on multiple ships, served with Naval Special Warfare, the SEALs, served with the National Security Agency for multiple tours. And it was a really, really great growth experience. And, I like to say my Navy story is kind of like the recruiter's dream come true. Guy joins Navy, goes away for 20 years, gets married, has a wife, 3 kids, comes home with, a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. So I was able to get my education while I was in. And a drive to serve even after I came home. So it's been a great story for the Navy, I think, and for me personally, I've enjoyed it, and I don't regret any of it. Now, that's not to be said that there weren't any challenges. My first tour, we had during boot camp, the bombings in Kenya and Tanzania happened. So that kind of shifted our posture a little bit because we didn't know what that meant. At that point, I hadn't joined the community yet, the IC, intelligence community, so I really had no context outside what you read in the newspaper and what's going on. So Kenya and Tanzania happened in boot camp. First duty station, we had stuff going on in the Balkans. And then 9/11 happened while I was going through some training in Pensacola. So, that literally shaped my entire 20-year career. 9/11 happened. I graduated from my class. We had scheduled, extended leave here in Orlando. Instead of taking that, we pushed up to our ship home ported out of Everett, Washington, the USS Abraham Lincoln. And tried to integrate into the ship as quickly as possible because we didn't know what that meant for the ship. Being new to the fleet, I guess you could say. The Abraham Lincoln wasn't my first duty station, it was my second, but coming from my community, we weren't familiar with surface warfare. So we wanted to get up there and learn as much as we could and be ready for whatever the world threw at us at that point. We wound up getting integrated into the ship. And then we had some intermediary challenges that we needed to address, I guess, before we even got to deploy. Went through the workup cycle, and we were on standby to deploy earlier than our original schedule because of events going on in Pakistan and India, which you see in the news even today with what's going on in Kashmir. So, India and Pakistan, 2 nuclear powers, were poised to poke at each other. And our ship was considered the ready carrier, so we were on standby to deploy. We wound up not having to deploy, thankfully, early, I should say, and that means we didn't, there was no nuclear war. So that's good news. We did wind up leaving I guess we came back in the winter. Well, actually, no, we came back in the summer. We were supposed to come back in the winter, so we left in the summer. We went on our 6-month routinely scheduled deployment. Went through from the Eastern Pacific through the Western Pacific, transited through the South China Sea, which is a hot spot, through the Straits of Malacca, visited a few ports, went to Hong Kong, Singapore, and then in-chopped the 5th Fleet Area of Operations, which is referred to as CENTCOM, on September 11th, 2002. Flew operations, I shouldn't say we flew, from the ship, our aircraft on the ship flew sorties for Operation Enduring Freedom, and as the intelligence guy, we kind of supported those guys, and so we supported Operation Enduring Freedom a year after 9/11 happened. We then went through the Straits of Hormuz, which is a critical choke point for the world because global energy goes through there. And then sat off the coast and supported Operation Southern Watch, where we were beginning to see war clouds build up back here in the States. And we flew Southern Watch, or supported Southern Watch operations in Iraq to make sure that those no-fly zones were protected because of the history there. We actually wound up leaving the Persian Gulf or Arabian Gulf on time, on schedule, and went to return home and spent Christmas off the coast of Australia, and then found out January 1st, after New Year's Eve, that we were being extended, and they used the word indefinitely, so we had no idea when we were coming home. Our 6-month routine deployment turned into we don't know how long it's going to be. A few good rumors came out that we were going to be coming home February 29th, and that was not a leap year. So the joke was that we'd be out there for a full year after that. That being said, we wound up going back down to Australia to have our flight deck resurfaced because we were an aircraft carrier, and we were going back to the Gulf to get ready for contingency operations in Iraq. In February, we wound up chopping 5th Fleet again, and going back into the Persian Gulf, and where we were the senior carrier. So we led operations from the Gulf, and 3 aircraft carriers in the Arabian Gulf and 2 aircraft carriers in the Mediterranean, supporting operations that started in March after some very historical events, which include Colin Powell testifying to the United Nations. And in the world basically making decisions as to whether or not they were going to support that. It was very controversial. But one of the things that you learn in the military, and I took to heart, was it's not our job to make those decisions. The people elect the commander-in-chief, and the commander-in-chief makes those decisions, and we follow orders. So that was one of my first tests of what it meant to be in the military and what it means to be in the military, and do something that may conflict with your personal values, because I was a big proponent of what we built after World War II and the United Nations and those international institutions that we built to prevent war. So that was a steeled moment for me in my career, and after that I almost got out of the Navy, simply because it was kind of a violation of who I felt we needed to be as the United States of America. I wound up staying in because it was something I'd always wanted to do, and my wife was pretty adamant that I shouldn't give up who I am because of the environment around me. If serving in the Navy was something that was important to me, all the more reason to stay in and be the outlier. One of the things we learned after Iraq and the intelligence community was groupthink was a terrible, horrible thing, and so my job as an analyst was to be the guy in the room who could think outside the box and maybe offer an alternative analysis. And that was my personal goal after that, and that's what drove me through the rest of my career, regardless of where I was serving. So after Iraq, in May, we wound up returning home. And before we got to Everett, which is where our ship was home ported out of at that point in time, we stopped off the coast of San Diego, picked up the president, commander-in-chief at that point in time, and he actually slept in the CO's import cabin right across from where my offices were. And the joke was that everyone knew I wasn't a big proponent of what was going on in Iraq. It's actually how I got my Navy nickname, which is the Liberal. Tongue-in-cheek, and we had a great relationship with folks who were from all walks of life, all across the country, all across the world. And that's one of the great things about being in the military, is that you're all there to do one thing, and that's serve your country. Follow orders and do the best you can with what you have. And so that nickname was actually given to me by a friend who, is from the other side ideologically and worldview. But I take pride in it because we're still friends to this day. And when I retired from the Navy 20 years later, that moment in my career steeled his respect for me because I stuck to my guns and stood true to what I believed at that point in time. And so those relationships we build in the Navy and we share are not driven by ideology, and they're not driven by partisan affiliations or race or religion. It's driven by the times in which you live and the circumstances under which you serve. As the president slept across the hallway and went to make a speech the night before we pulled into San Diego, they asked me if I wanted to go attend the speech, and I said no. But they understood why. And that night he slept, and before he flew off the flight deck of the aircraft carrier the next morning, and this is where you learn a lot about Navy chiefs who are very, very, very handy. In our space, we had the White House communications person out early before the president came on board, and we had learned that the president had a hankering for Whoppers. And so my chief actually taped Whoppers to the door outside our space, so as he went to fly off the next morning, he had to walk past our door. And the Secret Service was trying to keep things secure, so we had the door open, just kind of peeking. But the president saw the Whoppers that were taped to the door because underneath it had said "free bag of Whoppers" for a picture with the president. And so as he approached, my chief said, "Hey, President, would you mind taking a picture with me and my troops?" And I had just happened to be in the space at that point in time because the Secret Service was keeping everyone in. And so, at that moment, the president came into the space and said, "You can keep your Whoppers. I'd love to take a picture with you." And so at that moment, everybody turned, pivoted, and we had a picture with the President of the United States. Again, I didn't necessarily agree with some of his policies, and I never voted for the guy, but he was the commander-in-chief, and I now have my very own Forrest Gump moment. I didn't get to say I got shot in the buttocks, but it's one of those moments in history that as I went to study international relations down the road, that literally was a world moment, right? The mission accomplished banner, the speech off the coast of San Diego. What happened after that? We're still in Iraq to this day in some respects, doing counterterrorism operations, and some of that overflowed into Syria. So, there was a moment that basically changed the world, and we'll see where that decision takes us in the future. Coming home back to Everett, which is known for being an all-American city. Really great home port. My wife and I actually considered returning there and retiring because we saw some of the things that were going on back here in Florida while we were abroad, and we weren't sure if we wanted to come home to it. So we seriously considered retiring up there after we got out of the Navy. But because of Everett's history and that community's tie to the military, and that community having one of the highest populations of Iraqi immigrants or nationals in the community, the city of Everett hosted a parade for the ship's crew, and the only people who are not the ship's crew that were allowed to march in that parade with us were some of the Iraqi community there in Everett. And so that was kind of an encapsulation of that tour on the ship. But one of the things that stays with me to this day is a moment where we were walking in the parade with my wife and kids. I had my daughter who was born while I was on deployment, and my oldest son marching in the parade with my wife and I and the ship's crew and some of the sailors I'd served with. there was a police officer who was standing there keeping, the folks at bay because it was a parade and they wanted to keep the integrity of the parade moving forward and safe and whatnot. And parade stopped. We were walking and we stopped, and the police officer stopped and shook my hand, and he said, "Thank you for your service." And at that moment, I still get choked up. At that moment, I stopped and thanked him for his service, simply because he was the guy that my wife and kids were going to call while I was on the other side of the world. If anything had gone wrong, it was the folks in the community that we served in, and those leaders, police, firefighters, some of the folks that my wife went to church with, they were her first responders, and so I couldn't be there to protect them. And so I said, "No, thank you for your service." And we were both in uniform, and we both got a little weepy-eyed over it, over that exchange. But I carry that with me every day when I think about, what it takes to build a good society, a good community, something worth defending, something worth going on taking those risks and going to the other side of the world away from your family. The things that we do as a society, as a community, matter for folks who are overseas. Serving through holidays, whether or not they're in combat, they're still serving and they're ready for any contingency, right? So the things we do back home and the way we look out for each other in every way, shape, or form matters, at least for me specifically, and I think most people, as far as why we serve and what we do, and why we make the decisions we do while we're in the military. So Everett was huge for our family. The USS Abraham Lincoln was huge for our family. After that, we went and took a tour where it was a little more low-key. That 6-month deployment turned into basically a 10-month deployment. And we saw, the initiation of a war that, challenged us as a country and challenged the world as an international community. So went on to study political science, international relations, public policy that focused on national security. So that experience literally shaped everything I've done since then. After that, I did a tour where we focused on our family, and then wound up volunteering and screening to successfully go work with the Navy SEALs. My theory was that it was high risk. Wasn't necessarily enthusiastic about what the war on terror had become at that point, but I knew that in order to end the war on terror and the color-coded bar schemes, that we needed to wrap things up as quickly and as efficiently as possible. We couldn't do it with a big footprint, so naval special warfare was the right place to go next, because that was where we were going to nail down that challenge to where we could kind of decompress as a family. Or not as a family, but as a society. The unit that I worked with was very closely tied to the unit that ultimately got bin Laden. And so, while I wasn't with those folks when they got bin Laden, I helped support the build-up of the mission profile and the teams that went on to develop the procedures that deployed and got bin Laden. So, in a way, we were able to contribute, and we believed that when we got bin Laden, especially with the political environment we were in, challenging our own values, we knew that we'd be able to start de-escalating that and focusing on who we were as a nation and not living in fear. So that was a huge part of my career that I hope my wife and kids are proud of that we were a part of, because while we were working in that community, of course, there's a lot of work that goes on, and then a lot of that work is not done at home. While I was with that team, I wound up volunteering to deploy with a Joint Special Operations unit, and did a tour in Ramadi, Iraq, where I was working with Navy SEALs, Rangers, Air Force, combat controllers, and was doing ground assault force operations with folks who knew and understood that we had to find terrorists who were willing and able to do harm to our country's interests and those who were forward deployed, theoretically doing peace operations in Iraq after a mission was accomplished, right? After that tour, went in and did a tour as an instructor where, kind of had the opportunity to give back to the community that raised me and groomed me, allowed me to contribute to things that I felt were important. And plant the seed for the next generation of, of folks doing the work. And then still to this day, I get calls from folks asking, what we're doing and saying thank you for, the commitment we made to them. One of the other things that was important to me while I was at that command was helping to shape the culture of the future, because we had just come out of post 9/11. Some folks were skeptical as to what our values were and the melting pot culture that the military is, and who we wanted to be. I was there for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was significant because anyone who's willing to serve their country should be able to serve their country. And so as the Navy and the military adapted to that policy shift, because there had been a history there of folks who were lesbian, gay, bisexual, LGBT at that point, or LGB at that point, or bisexual, and then later the transgender shift happened, and I was able to help at least create some of the ground space that allowed folks to serve openly as who they were. That was important to me as and my family as far as who we were and what we stood for and what we served to defend, right? The freedom to serve your country and represent something bigger than yourself, or at least try to. I now work at the University of Central Florida and work for the Center for Public Nonprofit Management, where we serve the community in education and do research, right? So teaching and giving back are part of who I am now, and that's part of because of that tour there in the Navy. Leaving Pensacola and going to South Korea, where I was on a watch floor providing information, intelligence to folks back in D.C. and in the Pacific on what was going on there. And while I was there, Kim Jong-il passed and Kim Jong-un took over, which was a point in world history where we weren't sure what was going to come out of that. And still to this day, we don't know what that means. But our team was there monitoring the situation and providing reports that kept high-level decision makers abreast of what was going on. And so when we talk about, the Asia-Pacific national security issues and, nuclear proliferation and, geopolitical context between Japan and Korea and China and Japan and Korea, Australia, and even Russia and Taiwan, because it's a hotbed. There's a context there, and so watching the news to this day is always interesting. There's always a deeper context, I guess you could say, when you're reading the headlines, and that's something that serving in the Navy will never change my outlook on the world around me, I guess. After that tour, I wound up coming back to the States, and my family and I moved to San Diego, California, which is a place that we'd avoided like the plague my entire career. And it was stupid because San Diego was beautiful. We were stationed on board the USS San Diego, and we actually got to do a unique mission with NASA. When the ship got the mission, I was the operations department chief on the ship, and no one really knew what it meant, but being from Florida and watching the shuttle take off growing up, I knew that it was going to be something very cool and something that we could build with and rally the ship around. And, because folks on the ship come from all 50 states and even overseas territories, we wanted to use the mission with NASA to educate, educate folks on what NASA means for our country, and what its mission means, exploration and the history, and we choose to do the hard things, especially coming out of economic challenges that we came out of in 2009. We needed a rallying story, that built upon, the successes of the Bin Laden raid. So, I volunteered to be the action officer for that, and the Navy flew me home, and I got to spend the next 9 to 10 months of the year working with NASA to build the first book draft of the recovery procedures for the Orion multi-purpose crew vessel. Right, that was being built being built at disparate parts throughout the country, because that capsule is, an American project, if you will, Florida homeboy made good, right? The Navy paid me to work with NASA, so we were able to go out and recover, do the recovery procedures, and we were on deployment when the USS Anchorage actually went out and did the recovery. But the theory and science and research and whatnot is that you stand on the shoulders of giants. And so before we wrote our version of the book, we went back and did the history and studied the history of Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo, and the recoveries at sea that the Navy did then, and why the difference in procedures. As far as why we went with an LPD, an amphibious ship, versus the old flight deck or aircraft carrier or flat top, and we honed that historical context to educate the crew and the families of the crew and the waterfront there in San Diego, and hopefully it proliferated back in small ways through the families. But we also push forward and wanted the folks to know that this is something that the Navy should be a part of, and we should be proud of it, and something that the crew could hang their hat on, as being a part of history. And as we go to Mars, the theory is we won't lose the astronauts who pursue Mars in the Pacific Ocean when they get home. So that was one of our challenges to ourselves as a crew and as a team. How do we make sure that volunteers who choose to go and do hard things in space come home and get to see their families, because Mars is infinitely further away than the Middle East or the Western Pacific. And then of course my last tour was up in the DC area, and we had the opportunity to kind of put a bow on our 20 years of service. DC area is a mecca for folks in my community. At some point in your career, you're going to find yourself in DC, and so had the opportunity to serve with some really great folks who worked on some really, really great projects that basically preserved world peace to some respects. Some of that stuff is being unraveled now, but in the intelligence community, you get to do two things. One is you get to provide information that prevents World War III from breaking out, or you get to provide information that, should war be required, hopefully they go smoothly to where you lose as few lives as possible on both sides, and we get back to the table in a smart way, to where we can put a I wouldn't want to say put a bow on it, but wrap things up smoothly. And so, in my career, I had opportunities, or I should say, in my career, I served in times of war, and in my career, I served where we were working our hardest to prevent war, or at least make sure that people had the right information to where they could prevent war where they thought they should. And so that was how I concluded my career. My career started essentially when I was an 8-year-old watching Top Gun. And 30 years, because it was, the 10 years between when I saw Top Gun and when I actually joined the Navy, it kind of wrapped my personality in that goal. But then 20 years in the Navy, it shapes who you are and what you think you should do going forward. So it's good to be back in Orlando. It's good to be home. The challenges and opportunities that came with 20 years in the Navy I wouldn't trade any of them, because the good things make you who you are and the bad things make you who you are. The decision to come back home instead of going elsewhere, despite the shifts that we'd seen in the community here, one of the things that struck me was I came home from leave once. We had been stationed in Texas, and we were driving down 75, and huge Confederate flag somewhere on 75, and for me it was a little bit shocking, because it wasn't something that I had felt I was serving. And so it was kind of like a violation of our values as Americans, right? The Union flag versus the Confederate flag. I don't even know why someone would fly that flag here in the United States or in my home state. It's kind of offensive. But the question is, do you go and retire somewhere else, or do you come home and try to build the community you thought you grew up in, or at least help reshape it? And hopefully, we do that going forward, because, my kids are going to be here, my grandkids are going to be here. So hopefully, the idea of national service trickles into their lives, and we make Florida something that anyone who thumps their chest to the United States flag would be proud of. One of the other moments in time, I guess you could say, that where, it was kind of, we're serving abroad and trying to figure out where we fit in was, the big election of 2000. That was the first election I got to vote in, and I was an absentee voter from Seminole County, where, they made some decisions with what to do with absentee voting ballots, and when they were registering folks to vote, and that was controversial. It was one of the lawsuits that went up to the Supreme Court through the state and then up to the national Supreme Court. And being an absentee voter out of the state and sending your ballot home and assuming it counts, and assuming that it counted equally in relation to everyone else's ballot, was a challenging thing, because here you are serving your country, and the basic things that you're supporting and defending are being undermined by folks who are doing weird things with registration slips in your home county, making national news for it. What you defend and what you're trying to achieve or contribute to in some way, shape, or form matters. So that shapes how I engage with the community and what I think we should do as a society here in Florida, and how we treat folks, and the values that we defend, and how we empower people to participate in the system that people are deployed around the world to defend matter. The Sailor's Creed is something that I carried with me from the moment I went through boot camp, but it still resonates with me today, even now that I'm retired. The idea that I'm a United States sailor, support and defend the Constitution of the United States, and I will support and defend, represent the fighting spirit of the Navy and those who have gone before me to defend freedom and democracy around the world. That's something that, has guided me, and is a value that I hold deeply. So the idea of democratic participation is huge, and that's driven by both the military ethic and the idea of having to do that absentee. And there are people around the world who don't have that opportunity or don't have that right, and there are people in the United States who have had that opportunity and right subverted, but then there are some people who are just apathetic and don't participate, which kind of undermines how the military is used. And so it's the people on the end of the stick should be supported by people carrying the stick. And in our society, and the way we're supposed to operate is that means all of us are voting and participating in that decision-making process. So when I see folks get cynical about the institutions that we have, or don't participate in the inclusive democracy that we do have, it affects me personally, simply because I've been on the other end of that decision-making process, where a controversial election resulted in a controversial president resulted in a controversial decision to invade a foreign country and undermine the United Nations, something that we built after World War II, and actually drove me to volunteer to go deploy to Korea because that was the United Nations' first mission with the peacekeeping force. All those threads throughout my career have shaped who I am and what I think on a daily basis. And hopefully they shape how my kids view the world, because if it doesn't shape their view, then it's really lost. Because you're supposed to learn and pass those things on as you participate in what's going on around you. So all that being said, it's good to be home, and we're grateful to be home, and it's nice to have a quiet life now.